Russia's an annoyance. China is our great challenge, as you've heard today with folks talking about China. Russia's economy is the size of, what, Texas or New York State? It's, what, 70% dependent on natural resources? It's got lots of nuclear weapons, but in today's modern warfare, okay, when you talk about cyber, you talk about information warfare, economic warfare, and kinetic, guns up, nuclear weapons have taken less and less of an important role in the reality of what warfare is. And so I think Trump puts it in perspective, and I think that's what he's doing with, what he's trying to do is end the Cold War. Okay, he's trying to end the Cold War. The great geniuses of both political parties blew an opportunity in the 1990s to bring this thing to an end. And we've had to pay a price for it ever since then. What Donald Trump is trying to do is end the Korean War in the Korean Peninsula and end the Cold War. And all he's getting is grief from the globalists.
Let's talk about China.
Okay.
We've talked about China all day, about whether or not there's going to be a trade war. What we see happening, game this out for us. Where does this go? How does it end? We're not at this thing of a trade war. They've been in a trade war with us for 25 or 30 years. But we're at war with China. Ray Dalio, he tweeted it the other day. We're at war with China. There's three types of war. The Chinese look at it: information war, economic war, and guns up, kinetic war. They're been at economic war with us for 25 years. No great power in world history has ever looked away of their greatest threat and at the same time dissipated its energy on something. We spent $7 trillion. Brown University, the Watson Center, shown we spent $7 trillion in 17 years on this war on terror and the war in the Middle East, right, with very bad outcomes. And we've allowed the rise of China. In fact, many people in this room, the elites of our country, have exacerbated the rise of China. And we were told time and time again until Donald Trump got here that it was the inexorable rise of China. It was the second law of thermodynamics. This was a law of physics in the natural world. In fact, the whole Thucydides trap concept that Kissinger, these guys came up with, is based on the rising power and declining power. We're the declining power. That's the same theory they had before Ronald Reagan got here in the 1970s, that Russia and the Soviet Union was on the rise and we were on decline. That was what détente was about. That was what all the arms agreements were about. Ronald Reagan changed that and said, we can defeat these guys. We can bring this down. And it was supposed to be 40 years. It happened in 8 or 10 years. Same thing with Donald Trump. And he's mocked and ridiculed of not being some foreign policy expert. He's got enough understanding of the world and the way the world works to go after this. And quite frankly, we're winning. They talk about the Chinese haven't come back to us with a response on the trade thing. For the first time in the last 25 years, they don't know what to do. They're seeing an opponent that's standing up for themselves. It's not just the trade. The trade it's the scale and depth of the trade. And the way Trump proposes, he says it's 50, it's 200, it's supposed to be 100, it's 200, and it's another 200 if you retaliate. And by the way, if you even retaliate again, it may be another 500. You know, he's talking about right now $500 billion. That's just one. The 301s is what Silicon Valley came to us about. It's not the technology theft. It's the forced technology transfers. The third part's the ZTE, where we can basically implode these companies. I'm trying to game this out. So
here's the game. Right now, we're converging on a point, and they understand this. We could take the whole thing down. We could take the whole thing's built on a house of sand.
What if they sell our treasuries? What if they devalue their currency?
They devalue their currency. They're just going to flood more dollars out. They got $3 trillion of reserves, and trust me, in a New York second, that thing would flood out of the country in a second. That's what their own people think about their economy. We've allowed these guys to push us around. We've allowed these guys to take the South China Sea. When I was 22 years old as an ensign, JG in the Navy, it's central of the South China Sea to be free and open navigation. The Bush administration and the Obama administration looked the other day when they militarized it. It's Donald Trump that said. I hear all that, but I want to talk about where the trade war is going.
Well, I don't.
By the way, I think right now.
How does it end?
I think. How it ends is in victory. How it ends is in victory. Donald Trump is not going to back off this. The Chinese are going to blink right now.
What is victory?
Victory is when they give us full access to their markets. Victory is when they stop. Remember, the warlordism in China right now, and she is under, I think, tremendous pressure, is the state-owned industries. Remember, China, Made in China 2025, they told us it was to leapfrog us and to converge on advanced chip design, robotics, and artificial intelligence, to converge eventually with genetics, to converge on advanced manufacturing. What the reality is we saw in GTE is to get off the West supply chain for...
ZTE.
ZTE.
Yeah.
Getting off ZTE was to get off the West supply chain for components. I think the #1 thing you're going to see out of the trade war is the reorientation of the complete supply chain of Japan, Western Europe, and the United States and Southeast Asia, that 800 million people, even before you get to India, okay, around the freedom-loving countries. I think the regime in China is in deep trouble. Remember, this is different than the Chinese people. The Chinese people are some of the hardest working and best people in the world. It's this regime that has led them down this path, and it's this cult of personality around Xi that tried to get up in the United States' face. This trade war is going to end in victory, and what you're going to see is a reorientation of the entire supply chain out of China.
We discuss it in far simpler terms on CNBC frequently. It's when it's all said and done, are there going to be fewer tariffs in the world? Is China going to be more open, or is it going to be less open?
Let's go back to the G7 for a second. It's just not tariffs. It's all the G7 on the first day he got lit up, right? Lit up by everybody. The worst guy in the world. They're bending over the thing. Next morning he walks in there, says, "Hey, I got an idea. How about this idea? How about no tariffs? No tariffs whatsoever. Raw trade, reciprocity, no tariffs."
Yeah, Larry Kudlow brought that up this morning.
Hold on. But no subsidies. Macron didn't know what to do. Couldn't get out of a seat. Look. The whole scam is their state-owned industries. Brexit and 2016 are inextricably linked. What links them is China. It's China's exporting its deflation and Chinese exporting its excess capacity that has gutted the Midland heartlands of England, obviously through Germany, but and gutted the upper Midwest of the United States. If you go out to the Midwest and you give them a fire-breathing speech on China, you don't have to get them up to speed like you do the elites in New York. They understand it. J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegies, reminded me that these studies from MIT and Harvard showed there's a direct correlation between the factories that went overseas, the billets and jobs that went with them, and the opioid crisis. Remember, tariffs are not just about economics, and they're just not about manufacturing jobs. It is about self-worth and identity and people understanding they have jobs, okay? This is bringing these manufacturing jobs back.
Are good for the economy?
100% good for the economy. Great for the economy. It's going to rebuild our economy. It's going to bring our manufacturing base back.
We will continue to monitor that conversation with Steve Bannon, of course, taking place at Delivering Alpha. Let's bring in Eamon Jabbers, CNBC contributor Sarah Fagan, Jimmy Pethokoukis, and Dan Clifton. Eamon, I'll start with you. He said very clearly the trade war with China ends in victory. What's your take?
Yeah, Wilfred, I think Michelle Caruso-Cabrera walked him through there a number of the recent news items and got him to make a number of headlines here. I think the first one is that Steve Bannon thinks the president's performance in Helsinki was fine, and he says that that's a weak word, and he says that he didn't have the command performance that he had in Singapore. I think that will be a comment that will be remarked upon widely, and I think he also said that the president gravitates toward people who have strong personalities in terms of President Xi, President Putin, Erdogan in Turkey. But Bannon says he's fine with that because ultimately the president is leading here from a position of strength. I think that'll be a widely remarked upon comment. He also said that the meddling did happen in the U.S. election by Russia back in 2016, but he said the meddling was on the margins. That is, that the president, it appeared to be, the president was suggesting, Steve Bannon was suggesting the president should take the approach that there was Russian interference in the U.S. election, but it wasn't determinative. It didn't make the difference overall in the election, and Bannon seemed to not quite understand why the president can't separate those two things. He conflates those two things. And then finally, he addressed the trade issues right now, and he said, we are at war with China. And he referred repeatedly to the trade war. And you hear White House officials here on this complex trying to go out of their way extensively to avoid suggesting that we're at a trade war. They say it's a conflict, it's a dispute, it's something that could be resolved in a short term. Bannon's putting this in a multi-generational context here and suggesting that the rules-based international order de-industrialized the United States, particularly the upper Midwest. And he says we are in a trade war with China and that we've been in one kind of war or another with China for a long time now. Those are provocative comments.
Yeah, I mean, say what you will, Jimmy P., about Steve Bannon, and trust me, we're getting a lot of commentary pouring in, whether you agree with him or hate him. I mean, this is clearly a man that is familiar with the president's thinking, especially as it relates to trade. So when he says things like we're going to see a complete reorientation of supply chain around the freedom-loving countries, is that realistic?
Is Russia one of those freedom-loving countries? I think he included Russia as part of his sort of civilizational war against China. I don't consider Russia a liberal democracy or technically part of the West. Apparently he does, which may say how he values liberal democracy. But I'm interested in is, does the president really share his view of what this trade war, whatever he wants to call it, against China? He focused a lot on the technology. When I hear the president talk, he mostly talks about the trade deficit. China should buy more stuff. Occasionally, he'll mention like the tech aspect.
Larry Kudlow talked about it.
I don't know if he buys that. I don't know if he buys the Bannon. We're in a war for genetic engineering and nanotechnology supremacy.
Sarah, what's your take on that? Was there some sense in any of what we heard from Steve Bannon there?
Oh, I think, you know, look, he does know the president very well. He's familiar with his thinking. He's influential on the president. I suspect the president will pay attention to what he says. But, you know, where I do think Steve is right is, and I don't agree with President Trump's approach on this, but you do have to give President Trump some credit for moving these NATO countries to spend more on their own defense. I wouldn't call it a protectorate. It's a partnership. But he's right. Our European allies do need to do more. And I do think Trump is, again, his approach is off, but his approach is at least effective in getting them to spend more money.
So, Dan, let's get to the investor takeaway from all of this. You know, Michelle asked, what is winning? Because he says the U.S. is going to win this trade war. And Steve Bannon said full access to their markets. What kind of bumps along the way, if we even get there? I mean, how much pain is the market and the global economy going to have to endure to get to that prize if we even get there?
Sure, and I saw a lot of similarities between what Steve was saying and Larry Kudlow today. They just have very different ways of saying it. And if you take those the two speakers today from your conference, Larry was saying Trump needs a win on NAFTA, possibly EU autos, because we're going to focus on China. And what Steve Bannon just said is, put yourself in a seatbelt, lock yourself in. This is going to be a long process. It's not going to be short run. And it is akin to the buildup of the Soviet Union with Reagan fighting the Cold War. It's just going to be with China on trade policy rather than defense spending. And so from an investor takeaway, getting a win on the EU or NAFTA for Trump will be important. Investors have given Trump a pretty big leash on China because there is no timeline or deadline, and let the process play out. And Sarah, I think what Steve was saying is a win is two different parts of this. Number one, tariffs in China right now are about 9%. If you can get them down to the rest of the developed world at 3%, there will be better market access. And two, to stop stealing the intellectual property of the United States. If you get those two, that defines a victory. But it's not going to be easy to get there.
Yeah, someone should also comment on the deep immorality of Bannon's dystopian alternate reality, where China is forever poor. Is that what he thinks? That we should have kept China forever making $2 a day forever? Because that's basically where he's going.
This is an excellent point. My former boss, President Bush, used to talk about, you know, we're trying to create several 100,000 jobs a month in this country. They need to create millions of jobs a month. And that's what their leaders worry about, is job creation as people move into these cities. And Steve Bannon completely, as Jimmy pointed out, avoided the need for them to educate and employ their people.
Yeah. Listen, I'm okay. Go ahead.
Eamon, final word, because we're going to have to leave it there.
Sure, yeah. I just think that one of the things that Steve Bannon said there toward the end was maybe one of the most important things that we heard him say, and not something that they say here at the White House. He said, tariffs are not just about economics, they're about identity and self-worth. And he tied the tariffs right to the opioid crisis that's hurt so much of this country. When the White House officials now, currently, talk about the tariffs, they don't talk about it in that language. They talk about it as a negotiating tactic. They talk about it in terms of economics. He's saying this isn't about economics at all. What the president's doing here is about about identity. And I think that's powerful, and it explains a lot of this White House's approach, even though White House officials don't stand here necessarily on the North Lawn and say that on national television.